You walk along a narrow cobbled street in the early stillness of a Paris morning, the air cool against your cheeks and carrying the faint sweet dust of the bakeries starting their fires in unseen courtyards. The street is lined with tall houses whose shutters remain closed, their iron latches dark against pale stone, and nothing moves except a single cart far ahead, its wooden wheels creaking in a slow rhythm that seems to keep time with your own footsteps. You turn a corner where the lane tightens and the gutters still hold a trace of last night's rain in a thin, silent trickle. And there above a deep-set doorway hangs the sign of the binder's shop, its painted letters curling with age, swinging just enough to catch the first weak light that spills over the rooftops. The sign makes no sound, only a gentle shadow that moves across the wood of the door, and you stop before it, your hand reaching for the iron handle that is cool and smooth from years of use. The door swings inward on oiled hinges, and you step across the threshold into a world of half-light and settled dust, where the air itself seems thicker, carrying the layered smells of leather, old paper, wheat paste, and something sharper like iron gall ink dried long ago. Inside the bindery, the floorboards accept your weight with a soft creak that does not disturb the quiet but simply joins it. A single note added to a very old chord. The shop stretches back from the street window, which is not large but set high enough to let a slant of daylight fall directly onto the main workbench, and everything else recedes into a comfortable bloom. Against the left wall shelves climb from floor to ceiling, each one packed with different materials, and your eyes begin to separate them slowly. Stacks of unbound printed sheets folded in gatherings, their edges a uniform cream, rolls of linen thread on wooden spools, squares of calfskin and goat leather stacked with tissue between them, jars of powdered pigment labeled in a neat hand, bowls of dried paste residue waiting to be scrubbed, and small bundles of gold leaf tucked behind a guard that cast at catatatif. On the right wall, tools hang on pegs arranged by size, sewing frames, backing hammers, plows, bone folders of different lengths, and brushes with bristles worn to a particular angle. Nothing is out of place, and yet nothing seems artfully arranged. It is the order of long habit, a kind of patience that has settled into the very wood. Near the center of the room stands the main workbench, its surface scarred from countless trimming cuts, but polished by the passage of hands, and behind it, already seated on a low stool, is the master binder. He is a man of middle age whose brown hair is receding slightly at the temples, and he wears a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, an apron of heavy canvas tied around his waist. His hands are at rest on a volume that lies open in a wooden press, the pages still unpressed and slightly swollen from sewing, and he does not look up when you enter, because he knows the sound of your step and has heard it arrive at the same hour for many mornings. His attention remains on the page where his left thumb holds a fold, and you see the faint dusting of paper fibers on the dark hair of his forearm. Without a word he nods, a small movement that inclines his head barely an inch, and the acknowledgement ripples through the quiet, like a pebble dropped into still water. You respond by closing the door gently, turning the latch with a click that is both final and familiar, and then you move toward the back of the shop where your apron hangs on its own peg next to a shelf of marbling supplies. The walk from door to peg is perhaps 12 steps, but in the silent shop you take it slowly, letting your fingers brush the edge of the workbench as you pass, feeling the cool grain of the wood, the slight indentations where generations of binders press their tools. You lift the apron from its peg and slip the loop over your head, then tie the strings behind your back with a motion that needs no thought, the knot coming together under your fingers by itself. The apron is stained with old smudges of pigment, crimson, indigo, yellow ochre, and a deep char black that never quite washes out, and you know by touch the rough spots where paste dried into the weave. You take your stool from its place against the wall, a three-legged piece of beech wood with a top worn smooth as river stone, and carry it to the work table set beneath the window. This is your station, a smaller bench set perpendicular to the master's, tidy and waiting, with the marbling tray stored on edge against the wall, and the pitcher bowls and brushes lined in their precise order. This morning the light comes through the window at a low angle, and you can see the motes of dust suspended in it, each one drifting on a slow current of warmer air rising from the chimney at the back of the shop. The mantel clock, an old piece with a porcelain face and a brass pendulum, ticks steadily from its shelf among scraps of leather, and you let its rhythm settle into your breathing as you stand for a moment doing nothing, simply being in the space. This is part of the morning, the moment of arrival before any work begins, a kind of silent greeting to the tools and the materials that will occupy your hands for the day. The master turns a page in his book, the paper making a soft, dry rustle, and then the scratching of his needle begins again, as he sews a new gathering onto the cords, a sound so fine it is like a mouse walking across a piece of silk. Your first task is always the same, to bring the marbling tray from its place and set it onto the bench. The tray is a shallow rectangle of wood, perhaps 2 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, its bottom sealed with dark pitch at the corners to keep it watertight. You lift it with both hands, feeling the weight of it, and place it squarely in the center of your work area so that the long side runs parallel to your body. Next, you fetch the glazed pitcher from its hook, a heavy earthenware vessel with a pinched lid, and set it beside the tray along with a clean cloth folded into quarters. From a tall cupboard you take down a small stoneware jar that holds the dried gum tragacanth, the substance that will transform ordinary water into the thickened size upon which colors can float. The jar makes a faint clink as you set it on the bench, and you remove the cork stopper that has been carved to fit snugly, releasing a faint herbal scent, something like dried hay or the bark of a very old tree. The gum itself appears as pale, translucent ribbons, brittle and curled, no thicker than a fingernail, and you weigh out the proper amount on a small brass scale, tipping the fragments into the pan until the needle balances. Then you crumble them between your thumb and fingers, feeling the slight resistance before they crack and fall into the pitcher in small pieces that skitter against the glazed interior. With the gum now resting in the bottom of the pitcher, you carry it to the water crock in the corner, where a wooden lid covers the cool, dark reservoir, and you fill the pitcher to a mark scratched on its side. Back at your bench, you take up a glass rod, its ends rounded and smooth, and you begin to stir the water in slow circles, watching the tiny islands of gum soften and swell, the water gradually taking on a faintly cloudy hue. The stirring is not hurried. You let the rod move at a pace that feels almost like the pendulum of the clock, one revolution, then another, and the vortex that forms in the center of the pitcher pulls the fragments into a gentle spiral. The sound of the rod against the pitcher's wall is a soft, rhythmic tink, and it blends with the other small noises of the shop until you can no longer distinguish it. You stir until your wrist grows just slightly tired, then you stop and let the size rest, covering the pitcher with a folded cloth to keep dust from settling. The gum tragacanth will need time to dissolve completely, to give itself fully to the water, and while it rests, you have other preparations to make. You move to the pigment shelf, where jars of ground color wait in quiet ranks, each one labeled with a slip of paper inked in the master's hand. Today, the book that waits for its endpapers is bound in a plain calfskin, the color of dried oak leaves, and the marbling will be in a traditional pattern of blue, red, and a touch of yellow. You select 3 jars and carry them carefully, setting them beside the grinding slab that occupies the far end of your bench. The slab is a heavy rectangle of porphyry, grey-green and flecked with lighter crystals, set into a wooden frame that keeps it from shifting. Beside it lies the muller, a flat-bottomed glass tool with a stubby handle, and you clean both the slab and the muller with a damp cloth before beginning, wiping away any dust or residue from the previous day. The quiet of the shop wraps around these movements, and the master's needle continues its whisper, a kind of breathing that accompanies your own. You open the jar of blue pigment, a deep indigo that looks almost black in the dimness, and tip a small mound onto the center of the slab. The powder is fine and light, and a tiny puff of it rises as it falls, catching the light like a blue ghost that vanishes instantly. You add a few drops of water from a small cup, then set the mullet against the stone and begin to grind in a wide overlapping circle that spreads the pigment outward until the slab is coated in a thin blue paste. The pressure of the muller works the pigment particles against the stone, reducing any remaining grains to a consistency that will later float without sinking. The motion is repetitive, your shoulder rocking gently as you circle, and you watch the color change as it grinds, becoming richer and more even, a deep blue that holds no streaks. When it is ready, you scrape the paste into a small white bowl with a flexible blade of horn. Then add more water and stir with a clean brush until the color is the consistency of thin cream. You set the bowl aside and repeat the process for the red, a crimson lake made from cochineal that grinds into a brilliant ruby paste, and then for the yellow ochre, which is earthier and slightly heavier under the muller. Each color must be ground with the same care, the same slow patience, and you let yourself fall into the rhythm of it, the swish of the muller on stone, the tick of the clock, the creak of the master's stool as he shifts his weight. To each prepared pigment, you add a tiny drop of ox gall from a small bottle with a glass stopper, the liquid oily and brown, smelling faintly bitter. This addition will allow the color to spread on the size rather than sink, and you stir it in with the tip of the brush, watching how the pigment seems to loosen, growing more fluid and alive. The bowls are now ready, 3 shallow circles of intense color, and you set them near the marbling tray where the pitcher of size continues to rest under its cloth. The morning has advanced while you worked. A glance at the window shows the light moving higher, the sun now touching the spines of the books on the top shelf and making the gold tooling glint dully. The master has finished his sewing and is now positioning a book in the lying press, the wooden screws being tightened with a soft groaning sound that signifies pressure being applied evenly. You lift the cloth from the pitcher and look at the size. The cloud of undissolved gum has vanished, and the liquid is now clear and thick, moving sluggishly when you tip the pitcher slightly. To test it, you take a clean brush, dip it in plain water, and hold it over the tray, which you have not yet filled. The drip hesitation test is something you have learned from many days of watching and doing. A single drop of water let fall onto the surface of the size should not break through immediately, but instead hesitate, dimple the surface, and then slowly merge. The drop falls from your brush and meets the size with a tiny silent dot, pausing long enough for you to count a full second before it disappears. The size is ready. You pour it carefully from the pitcher into the marbling tray, a smooth stream that folds into the shallow basin without bubbles, and you watch the surface settle into a perfect plane, still as glass, holding the light in a pale gleam. The tray now contains a layer of thickened water no deeper than your smallest finger, and it waits for the colors that will float upon it, but that is for another chapter of the day. For now, you stand at your bench, the tools in their places, the light shifting minute by minute, and the shop around you breathes its slow, ancient breath, while the clock ticks on and the muted sounds of the street remain far outside, beyond the wooden door and the swinging sign. The shallow marbling tray now sits on your bench, its seasoned wood holding the light in a thin, pale gleam, as if the surface itself had been polished with the passing of years rather than wax or oil. You have poured the size, and the liquid lies perfectly still, a layer no thicker than your smallest finger, filling the rectangle from corner to corner without a single ripple. The tray is an object that has known this same quiet service for longer than anyone in the shop can remember. Its bottom shows the darkened pitch of many old resealings, and its inner walls bear a faint watermark where the gum tragacanth solution has dried and been refreshed season after season, leaving a ghost line like the memory of tides. You stand beside it now, not yet reaching for the bowls of color, because the size, though poured, is still settling into itself, finding the final balance of its viscosity, and there is no hurry anywhere in the room. The clock ticks on. The master's bone folder whispers across a fold of end paper in that other corner of the shop, and you let your attention rest gently on the surface. Before you, a quiet pond trapped in wood. To arrive at this stillness, you had to begin with the gum, and even now you can feel the faint memory of its brittle resistance in your fingertips. The gum tragacanth had come from the stoneware jar in its customary form, dry translucent ribbons, curled like the shed wings of insects, fragile enough to snap at the slightest pressure. You had weighed the ribbons on the brass scale until the needle balanced, and then you had taken them between your thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight coolness of the material. Its vegetable origin still present in a scent like dry grass after a summer without rain. Crumbling the ribbons into the pitcher had been a slow, deliberate task. Each piece makes a tiny click against the glazed interior, and you had paused between pinches to watch the fragments gather at the bottom. a scatter of pale shards that seem too insubstantial ever to thicken water into a canvas. The gum is a resin taken from the root of a low, thorny shrub that grows on rocky hillsides, and the journey from those distant slopes to this Parisian bindery is a thread of connection you sometimes consider without urgency, just letting the thought pass through your mind like one of the dust motes now drifting in the beam above the tray. You had filled the pitcher with cool water from the crock, the liquid splashing softly against the earthenware, and then you had set it on the bench beside the tray. The glass rod had been waiting on its folded cloth, its ends rounded and smooth from countless stirrings, and you had lifted it with the same gentle grip you use for every tool in the shop. Stirring the gum and water together is not a task that rewards speed. The fragments must soften gradually, absorbing moisture cell by cell until they swell into a translucent gel that gives itself to the liquid without protest. You had moved the rod in a slow circle, watching the vortex pull the shards into a lazy spiral that spun at the center of the pitcher like a small galaxy turning in the dim light. The sound of the rod against the pitcher's inner wall had been a soft, repetitive tink, a note that blended with the ticks of the clock and the occasional distant plop of a horse on the cobbles outside, and you had let your wrist find its own rhythm, one revolution every 2 or 3 heartbeats, until the fragments were no longer visible and the water had taken on a faintly clouded appearance. The first sign that the gum was beginning its transformation. The stirring had continued for a long while, long enough for the master to finish tying a set of cords and begin trimming the foredge of a text block with a broad-bladed knife that made a sound like a single, long breath drawn through the pages. You had paused once to rest your wrist, placing the rod across the mouth of the pitcher and flexing your fingers, but the size does not stop thickening just because the hand is still. The gum continues to dissolve into the water even in the absence of motion, the process running along its invisible chemical pathways. After the pause you had resumed stirring, but more slowly now, just gentle revolutions that kept the thickening liquid from separating, and you had noticed how the rod began to meet a slight resistance, a subtle drag that told you the viscosity was increasing, the water becoming something else entirely. When the stirring was finally complete, you had covered the pitcher with a clean cloth folded into quarters, its edges draping down the sides, and you had set it aside to rest. The resting of the size is as important as any active step, though it involves nothing more than waiting, a kind of patience that is a skill in itself. During this waiting, you had stepped back from the bench and let your eyes travel to the window, where the morning light fell in a broad beam across the floorboards, illuminating the dust that always drifts in the air of old rooms. Each mote moved on its own slow current, rising and falling with the warmth from the chimney and the subtle draughts that seeped around the window frame, and you had watched them without any particular thought, just noticing how they sparkled for an instant when they crossed the brightest part of the beam and then faded into the dimness beyond. The clock had marked the passing minutes with its steady pendulum, and the shop around you had been so still that you could hear the master breathing, a quiet sound, like the rustle of leaves. During this time, the gum tragacanth had been doing its silent work inside the covered pitcher, the last solid particles surrendering to the water, the long chains of molecules unfurling and tangling until the liquid grew thick and smooth, a solution that would support a drop of color as easily as a meadow supports a fallen petal. You had lifted the cloth once or twice to peer inside, seeing the cloudiness slowly clear into a transparent gel that clung to the glass rod when you dipped it in, drawing up in a thread that snapped back with a tiny shiver. The transformation had been gradual, and you had let it proceed at its own pace, because rushing would only result in an uneven size that would fail when the colors were laid upon it, a lesson learned long ago and now simply part of the rhythm of the day. Now, with the size already poured into the tray and settling under the beam of light, you think back on those moments of waiting with a kind of quiet appreciation. The tray itself was not always here. It had come to the shop decades before your own apprenticeship, built by a joiner who specialized in the shallow basins needed by binders and papermakers, and its wood is a dense, close-grained species that resists warping even after years of contact with water. You had taken it from its hook on the wall with both hands, feeling the weight of its history, and set it on the bench so that the light fell across it in a long rectangle. The inspection of the tray before each use, is a habit the master taught you without ever putting it into words. You run your fingertips along the seams, feeling for any crack in the pitch, any roughness that might catch a bristle or disturb the floating colors. Today the seams are smooth, the corners tight, and the whole vessel is fit for its purpose, ready to become the arena where blue and red and yellow will meet without mixing. The size still holds its faint gloss, and you lean closer to see how the light bends at the edges, a subtle curve of the surface known as the meniscus that proves the liquid is alive with tension, a skin strong enough to carry weight. You remember the test you performed just before pouring, the single drop of clean water that fell from the brush and hesitated for a full second before breaking through, and the memory is reassuring in the same way that a familiar sound is reassuring, a confirmation that the invisible forces are in balance. Now there is nothing more to do but let the size continue its settling, the last tiny currents dying away into perfect stillness, and you find that you are content to stand here beside the tray, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench, watching the surface with the same patient attention you had given to the dust motes. Outside the window, the morning has moved on. The sun is higher now, and the light that falls across the tray has shifted slightly, its angle changing by slow degrees that you can only notice if you look away and then look back. The sounds of the street remain muffled by the thick walls and the shutters, but occasionally a voice calls out from a distant doorway, a single word that evaporates before it can form meaning. And the cart you heard earlier has long since passed, its creak now just a memory, folded into the quiet of the shop. The master has finished his trimming and is now polishing the edges of a completed volume with an agate burnisher, a tool that makes a soft rhythmic hiss as it travels back and forth, a sound as regular as breathing. You let your own breathing match it for a few moments, your chest rising and falling in a steady cadence, and the stillness of the room seems to deepen, becoming not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a kind of listening. The marbling tray holds the size, and the size holds the potential for patterns that do not yet exist, but will soon be drawn from nothing with a comb and a stylus. A transformation as quiet as the one that turned brittle gum ribbons into this flexible, receptive skin. You think of the thickness of the layer, which is just deep enough to float the drops of pigment without letting them touch the bottom, and you calculate without numbers the amount of gum that has dissolved into this water, the weight you measured on the brass scale now spread invisibly through every drop. The chemistry of the size is something you understand with your hands and your eyes rather than with words. You know that if the gum were too concentrated, the colors would bead up like mercury, and if too dilute, they would sink straight to the bottom, taking the pattern with them. But today the balance is correct, proven by the hesitation of the test drop and the way the size clings to the glass rod in a slow, even coating. You lift your gaze from the tray and let it wander across the shop, taking in the familiar shapes of the presses standing in the corner like silent animals, the piled gatherings of paper that still smell faintly of the printing ink from the press across the river, the jars of pigment on their shelf waiting for their turn. Everything in the bindery is arranged for a purpose, and that purpose is to be ready, to wait without complaint for the hands that will use them, and in this moment you feel yourself to be one of those waiting things, content to stand still while the size finishes its final settling. The dust motes continue their slow dance in the beam of light, and you watch them with the same detachment that has carried you through the morning, a calm attention that asks for nothing and receives everything. When the size is fully silent and the surface shows no trace of movement, you will reach for the first bowl of blue pigment, but that motion still lies a few heartbeats in the future, and until then, you simply remain, the tray before you, the light shifting, the clock ticking, and the gum tragacanth holding its invisible web beneath the glassy surface, ready to become the ground on which colors will float and spread and find their form. With the size resting in its tray and the morning light now fully settled across your bench, you turn your attention to the row of earthenware jars that wait on the pigment shelf, their contents as old as the earth they came from and as carefully kept as any treasure in the shop. The shelf itself is a plank of dark, waxed wood set into the wall at chest height, and it holds perhaps a dozen vessels, each one labeled in the master's neat hand with a slip of paper yellowed at the edges: indigo, crimson lake, yellow ochre, verdigris, lamp black, burnt sienna, umber, and a few others that you have not yet used. The jars are of different sizes, some squat and wide-mouthed, others tall and narrow, and their glazed surfaces show the faint crackling that comes from kiln heat, followed by long years of cooler air. You stand before the shelf with your hands resting at your sides, letting your eyes travel over the labels while you decide which colors will best complement the calfskin binding that waits on the master's bench. A volume the color of dried oak leaves with a spine that will soon bear a title in gold. The decision is not difficult, because the pairing of colors to bindings follows a quiet logic of harmony, and you have absorbed this logic over many mornings without ever being formally taught. You reach for the indigo first, then the crimson lake, and finally the yellow ochre, lifting each jar in turn and carrying it to your work table where the grinding slab waits. The slab of porphyry is a rectangle of grey-green stone, flecked with tiny white crystals that sparkle in the light when you lean close, and it sits inside a shallow wooden frame that holds it steady against the press of the molar. You take a clean cloth from the hook beneath the bench and wipe the surface of the slab with slow circular motions, removing any dust that settled overnight or any faint residue from the last time it was used. The cloth comes away with a trace of pale grey, and you fold it and set it aside before wiping the muller as well. A heavy glass tool, shaped like a small handbell with a flat bottom, wider than your palm, at a stubby handle that fits the grip of thumb and forefinger. When both are clean and dry, you position the slab squarely before you and open the jar of indigo, loosening the cork with a gentle twist that makes a soft, dry pop, as if the jar itself were exhaling after a long silence. Inside, the pigment is a fine powder so dark it appears black in the shadow of the jar's mouth. But when you tilt the vessel slightly and the light reaches in, you see the deep blue that is the true heart of the color, an intense hue that seems to drink the light rather than reflect it. You tip a small mound of indigo onto the center of the slab, perhaps a teaspoon's worth, and the powder falls in a tiny avalanche that releases a puff of blue dust, a ghost that rises and then vanishes into the air. Using a small horn spoon, you shape the mound into a shallow crater with raised edges, the way one might prepare flour for an egg, and then you add water drop by drop from a small cup, counting the drops without really counting, just watching until the liquid begins to pool in the center and seep into the pigment. The water disappears quickly into the dry powder, darkening it, and you add a few more drops until a loose paste forms that will not fly away when you begin to grind. Then you set the muller onto the paste with a careful motion, feeling the slight resistance of the wet pigment against the flat glass, and you begin to move it in a wide circle that spreads the indigo out across the stone in a thin, even layer. The grinding of pigment is a motion that involves your whole arm, starting from the shoulder and flowing down through the elbow and wrist until it reaches the muller, which glides across the stone with a soft, gritty whisper. You make a full circle, perhaps 8 inches across, and at the end of the circle, the muller returns to its starting point, leaving a trail of blue that is slightly thinner than what came before. This circular path repeats again and again, and the sound it makes is a low, steady shushing, like the tide drawing back over fine sand, a sound so constant that after a while you stop hearing it as separate from the shop's other sounds, and it simply becomes part of the room's quiet hum. The master across his own bench is tapping a row of small brass type into a wooden stick with a tiny hammer, the taps ringing softly like a distant bell, and the two sounds, your grinding and his tapping, weave together into a loose rhythm that asks for no synchronization. As you grind, the pigment changes under the muller. The paste begins as a gritty mixture that you can feel resisting the glass, tiny hard particles that crunch and shift. But as the minutes pass and your circles continue, the grit grows finer until it is barely perceptible, replaced by a velvety smoothness that tells you the indigo has been reduced to its smallest possible grains. The color also deepens, becoming more vivid as the particles are separated and spread, and you watch the paste grow glossy, almost oily, catching the window light in a way that makes it look like a strip of silk stretched across the stone. The transformation is slow and cannot be hurried. You know from experience that stopping too soon will leave the pigment uneven, with some parts still coarse and others overworked, and so you continue the circles, letting your mind drift to the motion itself, the weight of the muller, the coolness of the stone through the wood frame, the way your breathing has settled into a pace that matches the circling. When the indigo feels perfectly smooth under the glass and no trace of grit remains, you stop and scrape the paste from the slab with a flexible blade of horn, gathering the deep blue into a small white bowl that you place near the tray. The bowl is one of a set made by a potter in the same quarter of the city. Its glaze a simple milky white that will not interfere with the color of the pigment, and you set it carefully aside before cleaning the slab and muller with a damp cloth, then a dry one, until all traces of blue are gone. The cloth shows a faint azure stain that will never wash out completely, a permanent record of the day, and you fold it and put it aside before reaching for the jar of crimson lake. The crimson lake is a pigment made from the dried bodies of cochineal insects, a process that happens far from this shop, in places where the small creatures feed on the pads of prickly pear cactus and are harvested by careful hands, and the result is a powder that is lighter than indigo, fluffier, and a brilliant warm red with just a hint of orange when it catches the light. You open the jar and tip a mound onto the freshly cleaned slab, watching how it falls with a softer puff than the indigo, almost like flour, and you shake the crater, add water, and set the muller to the stone again. The sound of grinding lake is slightly different from indigo, a higher, thinner shushing, because the particles are less dense and the paste spreads more readily, and you adjust your pressure to be a little lighter, letting the weight of the muller do most of the work. The red spreads across the porphyry in a brilliant circle, and as you grind it, the color intensifies until it is the shade of crushed raspberries or the inside of a rose in full bloom, a color so vivid it seems almost to hum in the light. The master glances over once, his needle paused, and then returns to his stitching without a word, the brief acknowledgement as fleeting as the passing of a cloud. The grinding of crimson lake takes a long time, because the cochineal particles are tiny, but they clump together easily, and you must break each clump with patient circular strokes until the paste is uniform. Your arm grows slightly warm from the motion, a gentle fatigue that is more pleasant than tiring, and you pause once to rest, placing the muller on a clean spot of the slab and shaking out your wrist. In the silence that follows, you hear the clock again, its steady tick, 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 that seems to count not the minutes, but the circles you have made and will make. Then you begin again, the muller traveling its endless loop, and you let your thoughts grow as smooth as the pigment, all edges worn away. When the crimson lake is ready, you scrape it into a second white bowl, cleaning the blade of horn between colors so as not to mix the red with the blue, and you set the bowl beside the first. The two colors sit side by side, blue and red, each vivid and alive, and you take a moment to look at them, to appreciate the long journey from insect and mineral to these pools of paste that will soon float on the sides. The cleaning of the slab and muller is repeated, the damp cloth turning pinkish and then being set aside, a clean dry cloth following to wipe away any moisture, because even a single drop of water left on the stone could dilute the next color. Now you reach for the yellow ochre, an earth pigment the color of sun-warmed clay, and its weight is heavier in the jar than the others. It smells slightly different, mineral and dry, like a field path after weeks of sun. The yellow ochre grinds differently too. It is coarser at the start, more resistant under the muller, and you must lean a little more into the stroke, letting your shoulder do the work while your wrist stays relaxed. The sound it makes is a lower, rougher shush, and you can feel the texture changing more slowly than the lake, the grit taking its time to surrender. Even so, you do not rush, because rushing the grinding of ochre would only leave the pigment uneven and the color muddy, and you want a clear, warm yellow that will glow beside the blue and red, completing the triad that will make the marbled paper come alive. The paste that forms is earthy and opaque, a buttery yellow that clings to the stone in thick streaks, and when you finally scrape it into its bowl, you notice that a little ochre dust has settled on the back of your hand, a fine golden powder that you brush away with your thumb. With all three bowls of pigment before you, you take down the small bottle of ox gall from its place on a high shelf, a bottle of dark glass with a ground glass stopper that fits so perfectly it makes no sound when you remove it. Ox gall is a liquid taken from the gall bladders of cattle, treated and strained until it is a clear brown fluid with a sharp, slightly bitter smell that lingers in the back of the throat, and its purpose in marbling is to break the surface tension of the pigment, so that it will spread flat and even on the sides rather than beading up into reluctant drops. You use the tip of a clean brush to draw up a single drop of the gall, Then let it fall into the indigo bowl, followed by a few drops of water, and you stir with the brush until the blue liquid thins to the consistency of thin cream. The same process is repeated for the crimson lake and the yellow ochre, each bowl receiving its drop of ox gall and water, each being stirred in its turn with the same slow, deliberate motion, the brush turning and turning until the pigment flows easily, and no sludge lingers at the bottom. Now the bowls are ready. 3 circles of intense color that will soon become the floating blooms from which the pattern is formed, and you set them in a neat row between the marbling tray and the pitcher. The light has shifted again while you worked, the beam from the window now falling almost directly on the tray and making the size gleam like a sheet of melted glass, and you notice that the surface is perfectly still as any water you have ever seen, holding the reflection of the ceiling beams in pale, wavering lines. The master has finished his typesetting and is now sewing the last gathering of a small octavo volume, his needle entering and exiting the folded pages with a whisper so faint it might be your imagination. The shop itself seems to hold its breath, the way a room does when it knows that something careful is about to begin, and you stand with your hands resting on the edge of the bench, looking at the bowls and the tray and the comb that hangs on its hook, ready for the next step, but not yet reaching for it. Because all the work you have done so far has been a preparation for a moment that will arrive in its own time. And there is no haste here, only the slow accumulation of readiness, the pigments waiting in their bowls, the size waiting in its wooden frame. The marbling tray has been waiting long enough now for the size to become as still as a frozen pond, and when you lean over it, you can see your own face reflected dimly in the surface, a pale oval with no detail, just a suggestion of shape hovering above the wooden rim. The gum tragacanth has done its work completely, binding the water into a liquid that is neither thin nor thick, but something in between, a substance that moves when you want it to move and stays when you want it to stay, a kind of patience made visible. You have been standing at the bench with the bowls of pigment arranged in their neat row, blue and red and yellow, each one stirred to the consistency of thin cream with its drop of ox gall, and now the moment has arrived to test the size one final time before committing the first color to its surface. The test is simple, a repetition of the same gesture you made earlier with a drop of plain water, but repetition is the heart of this craft, and you perform it with the same attention you would give to the most delicate step of the binding itself. You take a clean brush from the rack, a small pointed one with soft hog bristles that have been worn to a fine tip by many washings, and you dip it into a cup of clear water that sits beside the tray, letting the bristles drink until they are full, but not dripping. Holding the brush a finger's width above the center of the tray, you let a single drop form at the tip, a tiny silver bead that swells and trembles, and then falls of its own weight, breaking free without any shake or flick from your hand. The drop falls through the short distance of air and meets the surface of the size with a touch so light it makes no sound. And then you watch, your breathing slowed and your hand still as the drop hesitates. It does not break through immediately, but instead makes a small dimple in the size, a curved hollow that holds the light for a full heartbeat. And in that pause, you can see the surface tension of the gum solution resisting the water, the two liquids negotiating their meeting as if they were old acquaintances bowing to each other before an embrace. Then slowly, the dimple disappears and the drop merges into the size, leaving behind a faint circular disturbance that spreads outward in rings too gentle to name as ripples, more like the memory of a touch, and then the surface returns to stillness as if nothing had happened at all. The size is ready, and you set the clean brush aside, your confidence confirmed not by any rush of feeling, but by a quiet certainty that settles in your hands like a familiar weight. Now you reach for the bowl of blue pigment, the indigo that you ground so patiently into a velvety paste and thinned with water and ox gall until it flows easily from the bristles, and you lift the bowl in your left hand, holding it near the tray, while your right hand chooses a wider brush from the rack, one with a flat ferrule and bristles that spread into a soft fan. You dip the brush into the blue and let it soak up the color, then lift it out and hold it above the tray, allowing the excess to drip back into the bowl until the brush stops running. The first drop of color is the most important one, because it establishes the center around which the whole pattern will grow, and you position your hand carefully over the middle of the tray, Not too high and not too low. At a height you have learned through many attempts to be just right. The bristles of the brush point downward, and at the very tip a single drop of blue begins to gather, pulled by gravity, shining in the window light, like a tiny sapphire that has not yet hardened into stone. You let it fall without moving your hand, and the drop detaches cleanly, falling straight down and striking the exact center of the tray with a plip so faint you feel it more through your fingers than hear it through your ears. The moment the blue meets the size, something quiet and wonderful begins to happen. The drop does not sink, does not break apart, does not mix with the clear solution beneath it, but instead spreads outward in a perfect circle, the color unrolling like a bolt of silk being opened by invisible hands. The spreading is slow and even, the blue pushing outward in all directions at the same speed, and as it expands, its intensity fades from the deep indigo of the center to a paler blue at the leading edge, a gradient so smooth it looks like the sky just after sunset when the last light thins over the horizon. The circle continues to grow until it reaches perhaps the span of your two hands laid flat, and then it stops, its boundaries sharp and clean, a disk of floating color that rests on the size as lightly as a leaf on a pond. You watch it settle, the surface beneath it remaining completely invisible, and the contrast between the blue circle and the clear size around it is so crisp that the edge seems almost drawn with a fine pen, and the whole disk shimmers slightly as your breath moves across the tray. Now the second drop must fall, and you dip the brush into the red bowl, the crimson lake that glows like the heart of a poppy, and you raise it above the tray, positioning the tip exactly over the center of the blue disc. The red gathers at the bristles like a tiny ruby, and when you let it fall, it strikes the center of the blue with the same soft felt sound penetrating the first color without mixing into it, and then it too spreads outward, a circle of crimson blooming inside the blue, pushing the indigo farther toward the edges as it claims its own territory. The red expands until it is a disc perhaps half the size of the blue, and the two colors now float one inside the other, separated by a sharp boundary where the red ends and the blue begins, never blurring, never bleeding, because the gum tragacanth holds each drop in its own distinct layer, a property that feels almost like a small magic each time you see it. The tray now holds a target of 2 rings, blue embracing red, and the pattern is already beautiful in its simplicity, but it is only the beginning. You return to the blue bowl and dip the brush once more, carrying a smaller drop this time, and you let it fall not at the center but slightly to one side of the red disc, aiming for a spot where the blue already exists but could use reinforcement. The drop lands and spreads, but because it lands within the blue territory, it does not create a new ring, but instead thickens the existing blue, deepening the color at that spot and creating a slight asymmetry, an organic variation that will later be drawn into waves. Then you take up the yellow ochre with a smaller brush, a pointed one that holds just a bead of color, and you let 2 or 3 tiny drops fall at scattered points across the red disc, each one spreading into a small yellow circle that floats inside the crimson. And now the tray holds a composition of 3 colors arranged in concentric and scattered islands, blue outside, red inside, yellow dotted within the red, all floating on the thickened size, without sinking, without effort. The process of adding drops continues in this way, a slow alternation of colors and positions that builds up the pattern layer by layer. You work with a rhythm that is neither fast nor slow but simply steady, dipping the brush, raising it, letting the drop fall, watching it spread, and then dipping again. Each color behaves slightly differently on the size, and you have learned these differences not from instruction, but from observation. The way blue spreads the fastest and farthest, the way red is slightly denser and spreads a little more slowly, the way yellow, being the lightest, spreads the least and stays in tight circles that glow like small suns. The gum tragacanth accepts them all equally, its thick, calm surface never wavering, and as the minutes pass, the tray fills with a pattern of overlapping and adjacent color patches, each one distinct, each one floating in its own space, creating a kind of map of colored islands that will soon be drawn into a unified design. During this work, the shop around you remains as quiet as ever, the clock still ticking, the master still working at his own bench with that soft, repetitive whisper of thread through paper, and the light from the window continues its slow crawl across the floorboards. You are aware of these things without paying attention to them, the way you are aware of your own heartbeat without counting it, and your focus stays on the tray, on the tip of the brush, on the falling drops and the spreading circles. The occasional sound from outside, a distant cart, a fragment of a voice, a bird calling once from the gutter enters the shop and then fades without disturbing anything, like ripples that reach the edge of a pond and disappear. Your arm grows slightly tired from holding the brush, and you lower it to rest on the edge of the tray for a moment, letting the muscles relax while you study the pattern so far, noting where the blue is thin and could use another drop, where the red has crowded too close to the edge and should be balanced by more blue, where the yellow has clustered and needs to be broken up. The assessment takes only a few seconds, and then you resume, dipping and dropping, the rhythm re-establishing itself as naturally as breathing. When the tray is sufficiently covered with floating color, you stop adding drops and set the brush down across the bowl, stepping back just enough to see the whole composition at once. The surface of the size now resembles a field of concentric rings and scattered dots, a pattern that holds the light in dozens of small reflections, each circle of color bending the window beam slightly differently and creating a mosaic of blues and reds and yellows that seems almost to vibrate with stillness. The sharp boundaries between the colors are what make marbling distinct from any other kind of painting. Nowhere does the blue touch the red, nowhere does the yellow bleed into the crimson, and each drop remains a sovereign island held apart by the invisible architecture of the gum solution. This separation is the gift of the size, the reason for all the stirring and resting and testing. And as you look at the floating pattern, you understand again why this craft has been practiced in the same way for so long, because the beauty it creates is one that cannot be achieved by any faster or simpler method. The tray now holds everything it needs, and you will soon reach for the comb and the stylus to transform these simple circles into the rippling waves that are the classic marbled pattern. But before you do, you take a moment to let the colors rest. They have been disturbed by the falling of the drops, and although each circle has finished spreading, there are tiny residual movements in the size, currents too small to see, but large enough to affect the comb's path. You wait, your hands resting on the edge of the bench, your weight shifted slightly to 1 foot, and you watch the surface with the same patient attention you have given to every step of the morning. The master closes a book behind you with a soft, solid thump, and the sound travels through the floorboards into the soles of your shoes, but you do not turn, because your attention belongs to the tray, to the blue and red and yellow floating in their perfect separations, to the light that gleams on the surface, and to the quiet that fills the shop like water filling a basin. The colors are still now, the last microcurrents having died away, and the tray waits for the comb, the way a field of snow waits for the first footprint, ready and silent and full of potential. The colors have settled into perfect stillness on the surface of the size, each circle and dot of blue and red and yellow floating in its own distinct space, held apart by the invisible grip of the gum tragacanth solution. And now you turn your attention to the tools that will transform these scattered islands into the flowing pattern that defines marbled paper. On the wall beside your bench, 2 hooks support the comb and the stylus, each hanging by a leather loop that has been darkened by the oils of many fingers over many years. You reach for the comb first, lifting it from its hook with a motion that is slow and automatic, your hand knowing the weight of it before your mind can register the number of ounces, and you bring it to the tray where the floating colors wait like a sky full of still clouds. The comb is a simple tool, a strip of dense boxwood about the length of your forearm and the width of 2 fingers, into which a row of fine brass wires has been set at regular intervals. The wires are thin as sewing needles and spaced perhaps a 1/4 inch apart, each one extending downward from the wood by 1.5 inches, their tips filed to smooth points that will glide through the size without tearing the surface. The wood itself is pale and close-grained, polished to a satin finish by use, and it fits comfortably in your hand with your thumb resting along the top edge and your fingers curled beneath. A grip that allows for the gentlest possible pressure. You position yourself at the near end of the tray, standing squarely with both feet on the floorboards, and you lower the comb until the tips of the brass wires just touch the surface of the size at the very edge where the clear liquid meets the wooden rim. The first pass of the comb is always a straight line, a simple division that cuts through every color circle in its path, and begins the work of drawing the drops into bands. You lower the wires a fraction deeper, just enough that they enter the floating layer of pigment without scraping the bottom of the tray. And then you begin to draw the comb toward you along the full length of the tray, moving at a pace that is neither quick nor hesitant, but simply steady, the speed of a cloud's shadow crossing a field. The wires pass through the size with almost no resistance, a sensation like dragging a fine thread through heavy cream. And in their wake the circles of color stretch into thin parallel streaks, the blue pulling into long ribbons, the red elongating into slender bands, the yellow dots becoming delicate lines that run beside the others without ever blending. The sound the comb makes is barely a sound, just the faintest whisper of brass against liquid, a susurration so soft that if the clock were louder, you would not hear it at all, and you keep your breathing shallow so that your chest does not disturb your arm. Where the comb passes, the pattern transforms. A round blue patch that was once an island becomes a stretched oval, then a ribbon, then a thread of color that runs from one end of the tray to the other, parallel with its neighbors and separated by clear lanes of size. The red does the same, its crimson circles pulling into lines that alternate with the blue, and the yellow becomes a series of fine golden streaks that brighten the whole composition like sunlight caught in spun glass. The straight pass of the comb has imposed a simple order on the scattered drops, a grid of parallel lines that is pleasing in its regularity, and when you reach the far end of the tray and lift the comb away, the wires come up clean, with no pigment clinging to them, the size closing behind them without a scar. You step back for a moment and look at what the first pass has created. A field of blue and red and yellow lines running lengthwise from one end of the tray to the other, each one straight and true, each one separated from its neighbors by a gap of clear size. The pattern is already recognizable as the beginning of a marbled design, but it is still too simple, too mechanical, and the craft requires a second pass that will introduce the curves and waves that are the true signature of the art. You move to the side of the tray now, positioning yourself along its long edge, and you lower the comb again, this time at the far corner, the tips of the wires entering the size at a slight angle rather than straight on. You draw the comb across the width of the tray rather than its length, cutting perpendicular through the lines you have just made, and as the wires move, they push each color band into a gentle arc, a repeated scallop that rolls across the surface like a series of low hills seen from a great height. The lines that were straight become wavy, the blue ribbons undulating, the red streaks taking on the shape of flowing water, and the yellow brightens the peaks of each wave like foam on a gentle sea. This second pass takes longer than the first, not because the distance is greater, but because you move more slowly, letting each wire do its work without haste, and you watch the transformation with the same quiet attention you have given to every step of the morning. The pattern now resembles watered silk, the rippling fabric that shimmers in the light, and you can see how the comb has drawn the colors into a unified design that no longer shows any trace of the individual drops from which it began. The boundaries between the colors remain sharp, the blue never bleeding into the red never touching the yellow, but now they move together in a synchronized rhythm, a dance of pigments that flows from one end of the tray to the other, and the whole surface seems to breeze with a gentle, frozen motion. Now the comb has done its work, and you set it aside on a clean cloth, its brass wires still wet with size but unmarred by any trace of color, and you reach for the stylus. The stylus is an even simpler tool than the comb, a straight brass pin no longer than your finger, set into a turned wooden handle that fits the grip of your thumb and first two fingers. Its tip is blunt and polished, and where the comb creates broad patterns across the whole tray, the stylus creates fine details, the delicate flourishes that give each marbled sheet its individual character. You position yourself at one end of the tray and lower the stylus until its tip just dimples the surface of the size, and then you begin to draw a series of gentle curves that run through the wavy bands, the stylus moving in a slow, sinuous path like a snake gliding across calm water. The tip of the stylus parts the colors without disturbing their balance, pulling a fine line of blue through the red, a thread of yellow through the blue, creating secondary patterns that are smaller and more intricate than the comb's broad strokes. You move your hand from the wrist rather than the shoulder now, making small controlled gestures that feel almost like writing, a kind of calligraphy performed on liquid rather than paper, and the patterns that emerge are reminiscent of the veins in a leaf or the grain in a piece of polished stone. The stylus traces its path without resistance, the brass slipping through the thickened water as if it were oil, and behind it the colors flow back together without a seam, the surface healing itself instantly so that no mark of the tool remains visible, only the new curves of pigment that it has drawn into being. You work the stylus along the length of the tray, then back again in the opposite direction, the second set of curves intersecting the first to create a pattern known as the snail, a tight spiral that repeats across the surface in a regular but not mechanical rhythm, each spiral slightly different from its neighbors, because your hand is not a machine and never draws the same line twice. The spirals open like ferns unfurling in the spring, each one a small vortex of blue and red and yellow that catches the light and holds it. And as you near the end of the tray, the whole surface is alive with these small swirls, each one distinct, each one part of the larger whole, the comb's broad waves now enriched with the stylus's fine detail. During this slow work, the master has risen from his bench and walked quietly to the cupboard at the back of the shop, his footsteps making the floorboards creak in a familiar sequence, and you hear him pour a cup of water from the crock, the sound of the liquid falling into a tin cup, a bright, brief note that fades quickly. He returns to his bench without speaking, and the shop settles back into its rhythm of small sounds, the clock ticking, the pages of the book he is trimming rustling softly as he turns them, the stylus in your hand whispering across the size. The light from the window has shifted again, climbing higher and growing warmer, and you notice that it now falls directly on the tray, illuminating the pattern from above so that the colors seem to glow from within, the blue deepening to a midnight hue, the red brightening to a rich scarlet, the yellow shimmering like pale honey. You finish the last spiral and lift the stylus from the size, wiping the tip with a small square of linen that you keep in your apron pocket for this very purpose, and then you place the tool back on its hook where it will wait for the next sheet and the next pattern. The tray before you is now a complete design, a field of interlocking waves and spirals that holds the three colors in perfect suspension, each hue occupying its own space without encroaching on the others, the whole composition as orderly as a garden parterre and yet as organic as a ripple of wind across a wheat field. The gum tragacanth is held firm throughout the combing in the stylus work, its viscosity never faltering, its surface never breaking, and you feel a quiet satisfaction that is not pride, but simply the recognition that the size has performed its task and you have performed yours, and the result is what it should be. You rest your hands on the edge of the tray and let your eyes travel slowly across the pattern, noting the places where the waves are most even, the spots where the spirals are most tightly curled, the subtle variations that make this sheet different from every other sheet you have marbled or will ever marble. The pattern is fixed for now, floating on the sides like a tapestry laid on glass, but it will not remain there much longer, because the next step will transfer it permanently to paper, lifting the colors off the liquid and onto a sheet that will become the inside cover of a bound book. But before you take that step, you let the pattern rest, the colors settling once more after the disturbance of the comb and stylus, and you look around the shop, at the tools hanging in their places, at the stacks of paper waiting on the shelves, at the stacks of paper waiting on the shelves, at the master who is now sewing a strip of linen onto the spine of a text block, his needle moving in and out with the regularity of a pendulum. The morning's passed almost without your notices if things got in the word the charm of a long day that is not yet half over, the stillness of a place where things are made slowly and well, where each movement has its purpose and each pause its reason, and where the floating colors on the tray are only the most visible part of a much larger quiet, one that extends through the walls and into the street and the city beyond, all the way to the distant hillsides where the turbgunshras fach craved heaved. The pattern on the sides is complete now, a field of blue and red and yellow drawn into waves and spirals that float without motion on the thickened water, and the next step waits for you like a held breath. On the bench beside the tray, separate from the other stacks of paper and kept under a light pressing board to guard against humidity, lies the paper that will receive the design, a sheet of clean, unsized stock cut to the exact dimensions of the book that will one day wear it as its end paper. You reach for the sheet with both hands, lifting it by the edges so that your fingers do not touch its surface, because even the slightest oil from the skin can create a resistant spot where the color will not adhere. A lesson learned long ago and now ingrained in your movements without conscious thought. The paper is a fine soft sheet made from linen rags that were beaten to a pulp and formed on a mold in a mill outside the city, and it has a subtle texture that you can feel through your fingertips, a slight tooth that will grip the pigment and hold it. Its color is a warm cream, not white, and it carries the watermark of the papermaker, a small crown and fleur-de-lis that shows as a pale ghost when you tilt the sheet toward the light. You bring the paper to the tray and stand at the narrow end, positioning yourself so that your body casts no shadow across the size, because even a sudden dimming of the light could cause a temperature shift in the surface and disturb the floating colors. The transfer of the pattern from liquid to paper is the step that requires the most steadiness of hand and the most calm of mind, and you have learned to approach it with a kind of quiet focus that empties your thoughts of everything except the sheet and the tray and the distance between them. You hold the paper by its short edges, your hands spaced evenly, and you bow it slightly in the middle, creating a gentle curve that will allow you to lay it down without trapping any bubbles of air beneath the surface. The bow is shallow, just enough to give the paper a soft arch, and you hold it there for a moment while you check the alignment, your eyes moving from the far corner of the tray to the near edge of the sheet, confirming that the paper will land squarely on the size and capture the full pattern without cropping any of the design. The master at his bench behind you has paused in his work, not to watch, because he has seen this 1,000 times, but out of respect for the concentration that fills the space around the tray, a silence that asks for no interruption. You lower the far edge of the paper first, the short side that is farthest from your body, and you let it touch the size at the very corner of the tray, the point where the liquid meets the wood in a dark, curved meniscus. The contact is soft, the paper meeting the size with a faint, wet whisper that is the first sound in a sequence of sounds that will mark the transfer, and you hold that corner steady while you begin to roll the rest of the sheet downward, lowering your hands in a slow, controlled motion that allows the paper to settle onto the surface from one end to the other in a continuous wave. As the paper touches the size, the colors beneath it come alive for the last time, the blue and red and yellow pressing upward into the fibers of the sheet, and you can see the pattern through the paper as it wets, the design appearing in reverse on the upper side like a ghost image that darkens as the moisture soaks through. The paper drinks the size and the pigment together, the gum tragacanth acting as a binder that will fix the colors to the fibers once the sheet dries, and the absorption is fast and even, the whole sheet becoming damp and translucent in the space of a single breath. The rolling motion continues, your hands lowering in perfect unison, and the paper settles onto the size without a wrinkle, without a trapped bubble, without any hesitation, the bow you made in the sheet flattening out as it meets the liquid, and the whole surface adhering to the size in a smooth, unbroken contact. When the paper is fully laid down, its edges floating just inside the wooden rim of the tray on all four sides, you release your grip and let the sheet rest, its weight pressing it into the size, the colors below it now hidden completely from view. The top side of the paper, the side that will become the visible surface of the end paper, shows the pattern in a muted version, the colors dulled by the wetness and the thickness of the sheet, but you can still see the waves and spirals clearly, the blue and red and yellow arranged in the exact same design you drew with comb and stylus, now reversed left to right as a reflection in a mirror. The paper must rest on the size for a short while, not long, but long enough for the pigment to transfer completely and for the gum to begin its work of binding the colors to the fibers, and during this pause you do not step away or turn your attention to something else, but instead remain standing at the tray, your hands resting lightly on the bench, your eyes on the damp sheet. The shop around you ticks and rustles in its usual manner, the clock marking the seconds, the master resuming his sewing now that the critical moment has passed, and you listen to these sounds without naming them, letting them fill the quiet while you wait. The paper darkens slightly as it absorbs more of the size, the pattern becoming fainter on the upper side as the pigment sinks deeper into the sheet, and you know from the way the dampness spreads that the transfer is happening evenly, the colors releasing from the size and gripping the paper with the same tenacity that once held them floating on the surface. When the moment is right, a timing you feel rather than measure, you reach for the near corner of the paper, the short edge closest to your body, and you pinch it gently between your thumb and forefinger, the wet paper cool and soft against your skin. The lifting of the sheet is a single motion, smooth and unhurried, the opposite of the laying down. You pull the corner upward and toward you in a diagonal line, peeling the paper off the sides at an angle that allows the excess liquid to drain back into the tray, rather than running across the surface and disturbing the pattern. The paper comes away with a soft sucking sound, a quiet schlip that is one of the most familiar notes in the whole shop, and as it rises, the colors appear again on the underside, the side that was face down, and they are bright and sharp and vivid, the pattern fully transferred and now fixed in the fibers. The size beneath the paper is clear again, almost clear, just a faint grey cloud where the pigment used to be, and you hold the sheet up for a moment, letting the excess liquid drip from the lower edge back into the tray in a slow string of clear drops. The marbled paper, now wet and heavy and glowing with color, is a beautiful thing to behold. The pattern that was once floating on liquid is now solid and permanent. The waves and spirals as crisp as they were on the sides, but now part of the paper itself. The blue deep and rich, the red brilliant as new velvet, the yellow bright as fresh butter, each color holding its place without bleeding or blurring, the sharp boundaries between them preserved exactly as the gum tragacanth had arranged them. The sheet droops slightly in your hands from the weight of the moisture, and you turn it slowly to inspect the transfer, making sure that the full pattern is lifted, that no bare spots remain where the paper failed to make contact, that the edges are clean and the corners square. The inspection takes only a moment, because your eye is practiced and knows what to look for, and today the transfer is flawless, the pattern complete from edge to edge, the colors vivid, the design as intricate as any you have made. You carry the wet sheet carefully across the shop toward the drying line that runs along the back wall near the chimney, where the air is warmest and the slight draft from the flue will draw moisture away from the paper without causing it to curl. Other sheets from previous days hang there already, their marbled patterns dried to a matte finish, and their colors are slightly more muted than the wet sheet in your hands, a reminder of how the pigments will soften as they dry. The drying line is a length of strong twine stretched between two iron hooks screwed into the wall beams, and you lift the marbled paper and drape it over the string so that it hangs in a gentle inverted V, the two halves sloping down on either side without creasing. You adjust it slightly, making sure the weight is balanced so that the sheet will not slide to one side or the other, and then you step back and let it be, the wet paper beginning its slow journey toward dryness, the air around it moving with an almost imperceptible current that you can feel on your cheek when you stand close. You return to the bench and look at the tray, where the size still fills the wooden basin and the ghost of the pattern still lingers as a faint grey film on the surface, the remnants of pigment that were not taken up by the paper. Before you can marble another sheet, the size must be cleaned, the residual color skimmed away so that it will not contaminate the next design, and you take up a wide strip of stiff paper that you keep for this purpose. A piece of waste stock that is already stained with old colors from previous cleanings. You touch one edge of the strip to the far end of the tray and draw it slowly across the surface, skimming the size of its leftover pigment, and the strip lifts the grey film in a single pass, gathering it into a thin, dirty layer that you then discard into a bucket beneath the bench. The size beneath is now clean and clear, ready to receive new drops of color for the next sheet, and you cover the tray with a loose cloth to keep dust from settling while you prepare for the next cycle. But before you begin again, you pause and turn to look at the marbled sheet hanging on the line, its colors already beginning to dull as the moisture evaporates, its pattern growing more subtle and refined with each passing minute. The sheet will hang there for some hours, drying completely before it can be trimmed and pressed, and eventually pasted into the cover of a book. And you know that this sheet, like every sheet you marble, will outlast you by centuries, the pigments and the paper and the gum tragacanth, all working together to create something that time will darken, but not destroy. The thought is a quiet one, not loud or proud, just a simple recognition of the permanence of the craft, and you let it drift through your mind and then away, replaced by the immediate task of preparing the next sheet and cleaning the brushes and checking the size. Because the day is not yet over, and there are more end papers to be made, more transfers to be lifted from the patient surface of the waiting tray. The marbled sheet hangs on the drying line now, its wet surface gleaming dully in the warm air that rises from the chimney wall. and you stand for a moment with your hands resting at your sides, watching the paper begin its slow transformation from a saturated, heavy thing into a finished end paper. The line stretches across the back of the shop in a sagging curve that has been made permanent by years of supporting wet sheets, the twine worn smooth and darkened by moisture and pigment, and it is anchored to two iron hooks that were driven into the heavy beams long before you first set foot in this room. The sheet itself is draped in a gentle inverted V, the two halves sloping down at equal angles, balanced so precisely that it will not slide or drift. And as you look at it, you notice the tiny movements of the paper as it adjusts to its new position, the slight expansion of the fibers relaxing into the shape they will hold when dry. Other sheets from previous days hang beside it, a row of silent companions that are further along in the process, their colors already dulled to the matte softness of finished marbling, their edges beginning to curl slightly as the last moisture leaves them, and the whole line of papers forms a kind of calendar of drying. A visual record of the days that came before this one. The back of the shop near the chimney is the warmest part of the room, a constant, gentle heat that radiates through the plaster and the bricks and into the air, and you feel it on your face as you stand there, a mild glow that is pleasant without being hot. The chimney breast is a wide structure of old brick, soot darkened near the small hearth where a low fire burns in the colder months. But now, in this mild season, the fire is not lit, and the warmth comes only from the sun that has been heating the roof tiles all morning, and from the residual memory of fires past, the bricks releasing their stored warmth in a slow, invisible exhalation. This is the best place in the shop for drying paper, because the air moves just enough to carry moisture away without creating a draft that would make the sheets flap or curl unevenly, and you have learned to place each sheet in the same spot along the line, the position that receives the most balanced combination of warmth and stillness. You turn from the drying line and return to your bench, where the marbling tray still holds the size and the ghost of the pattern you have just lifted, a faint grey film that floats on the surface like a memory. Before you can marble another sheet, the size must be cleaned, and you gather the tools for this task with the same unhurried movements that have carried you through the whole morning. The skimming of the size is a small ritual in itself, a kind of miniature harvesting that removes the leftover pigment so that the next design can be laid down on a pristine surface. You take up the wide strip of stiff waste paper that serves as your skimmer, a piece of rough brown stock that has been used so many times its leading edge is stained with a rainbow of old colors, streaks of blue and red and yellow and green from sheets marbled long ago, a chaotic pattern that is itself a record of the work. Holding the strip by its dry end, you touch the opposite edge to the far end of the tray where the size meets the wood, and you draw it slowly, steadily toward you, the strip moving across the surface with a faint, wet hiss. The grey film of residual pigment gathers against the leading edge, pushed along like a thin, dirty foam, and by the time you reach the near end of the tray, the strip has collected all of the leftover colour into a narrow band that you lift away and drop into the bucket beneath the bench. The size is clear again, a pale, transparent liquid that shows the bottom of the tray through its shallow depth, and it is ready to receive new drops of colour for the next sheet. But you do not begin a new pattern yet, because the cleaning of the tray is only one part of the resetting process. The size itself, having been used once, is slightly altered, a tiny amount of its gum content having been taken up by the paper along with the pigment, and you know from experience that it will need a small refreshment before it will perform as well for the second sheet. You take the pitcher that still holds the remaining size, the same glazed earthenware vessel you mixed earlier, and you pour a thin stream into the tray, adding perhaps a cupful to make up for what was lost. The new size merges with the old without disturbance, the two liquids of the same consistency blending instantly, and you dip the glass rod into the tray and stir once, twice, 3 times in a slow circle, not enough to create a vortex, but just enough to mix the new size into the old. Then you cover the tray with a loose cloth and let it rest again, the gum molecules finding their new equilibrium, the surface settling into the stillness that the colors will require. With the tray reset and resting, you have a space of time to attend to other small tasks while the marbled sheet begins its drying, and you move through them with the same steady rhythm, one thing following another in a quiet chain. The brushes that you use to drop the pigment onto the size must be washed, because if the color dries in the bristles, they will stiffen and become useless, and you gather them from the bench where they lie beside the bowls, their tips still stained with indigo and crimson and ochre. You carry them to the bucket of clean water that stands in the corner near the water crock, and you rinse each brush in turn, swishing the bristles gently through the water and watching the color bleed out in clouds that spiral and fade. The blue brush releases a deep indigo plume that stains the water before dissipating. The red brush a softer rose, the yellow a pale golden swirl that disappears almost immediately, and you work the bristles between your thumb and fingers under the surface to loosen any pigment that has clung near the ferrule. When the water runs clear from each brush, you shake them out with a flick of your wrist, the droplets scattering onto the floorboards in a fine spray, and then you reshape the bristles with your fingers and lay them flat on a clean cloth to dry. The brushes will be ready again when you need them, and you leave them on the cloth with the same care you would give to any tool that serves you well. Next, you turn your attention to the bowls of pigment, the small white vessels that still hold the remaining color, each one half full of the thinned mixture you prepared that morning. The pigment inside them has begun to settle while they sat undisturbed, the heavier particles drifting downward to form a thin sludge at the bottom of each bowl, and you take up the clean glass rod and stir them one by one, the blue first, then the red, then the yellow, each stirring a slow circular motion that lifts the settled pigment back into suspension. The colors bloom again in their bowls, vivid and alive, and you cover each one with a small square of paper to keep dust from settling on the surface, because even a single mote of dust falling into the pigment can create a blemish on the next marbled sheet. The bowls are set back in their row beside the tray, ready for when you will need them again, and you wipe the glass rod clean and set it on its folded cloth. The small actions accumulating like the ticks of the clock. Now you let yourself pause, because the afternoon has advanced to that quiet hour when the light begins to soften and the shadows grow longer and the whole shop seems to settle deeper into its own stillness. You walk slowly back to the drying line, your footsteps quiet on the floorboards, and you stand before the marbled sheet to examine its progress. The transformation of the paper from wet to dry is a slow, incremental process, almost invisible if you watch continuously. But since you have been away for a little while, the changes are noticeable. The gloss that covered the surface when it first hung on the line has begun to retreat, dulling first at the edges and then moving inward toward the center, and the sheet now shows a mixture of textures, the edges matte and the middle still slightly shiny, a kind of tidal zone of drying that creeps forward minute by minute. The colors have softened as the moisture leaves them, the blue shifting from a brilliant midnight to a more muted slate, the red from a vivid scarlet to a deep, calm burgundy, the yellow from bright gold to a warm, buttery hue, and the whole pattern looks as though it has been aged by a gentle hand, given a patina of restraint that makes it more beautiful, not less. This dulling of the gloss into a matte skin of pure color is one of the small satisfactions of marbling, a transformation that cannot be hurried or controlled, but only watched with patience. And you stand there for some time, your eyes moving from the sheet to its drier neighbors and back again, comparing the stages of the process. The sheets from 3 days ago are completely dry now, their surfaces uniform and flat, their colors fully matured, and they hang on the line with a slight stiffness, the paper no longer flexible but firm, like a piece of thin card. The sheets from yesterday are almost dry, just a faint coolness remaining at their centers, and they will be ready to take down and press by the end of the afternoon or the start of the next morning. The sheet you hung only moments ago is still in the earliest stage, its moisture heavy and its colors still bright, and it will need many more hours of hanging before it joins its companions. The progression is a slow calendar, a visual measure of the days, and you find a quiet comfort in it, the way one finds comfort in the steady turning of seasons or the regular phases of the moon. The scent near the drying line is a subtle thing, a mixture of the gum tragacanth, which smells faintly of dry grass and warm earth, and the iron oxide in the red pigment, which carries a slightly metallic tang, like the smell of rain on stone. It is not a strong odor, just a background note that you notice when you stand close, and it mingles with the other smells of the shop, the leather and the paste and the old paper and the faint sootiness of the chimney, to create a perfume that you have long since stopped being aware of, consciously, but that you would recognize anywhere, the smell of the bindery as distinct as the smell of home. You turn away from the drying line and let your gaze wander across the shop, taking in the familiar shapes and shadows. The master is still at his bench, his work now focused on a different volume, a larger folio with a spine that requires extra sewing, and his needle moves in and out with the same patient rhythm it has maintained all day. The light from the window has shifted into its afternoon angle, falling lower and more golden, and it casts long rectangles across the floor and up the sides of the shelves, illuminating the jars of pigment and the rolls of thread and the tools on their hooks. Dust motes still drift in the beams, slower now as if they too have grown tired as the day wears on, and the clock on its shelf ticks its steady, unhurried measure. The whole room is a picture of calm industry, a place where things are made without haste, and you feel yourself a part of that calm, a small moving piece in a larger stillness. You return to your bench and consider the tray, which is still covered with its cloth and still resting its refreshed size, waiting for the next pattern, but you decide to let it rest a little longer while you attend to another task that has been waiting in the back of your mind. The bowls from the morning are not the only ones that need attention. The grinding slab and muller must be washed thoroughly at the end of each use, and you have not yet done so since finishing the pigments. You carry the slab to the bucket in the corner, the heavy porphyry stone cradled in both hands, and you set it down gently on the floorboards so that you can pour water over it and scrub away the faint stains that the grinding has left behind. The muller follows, and you use a stiff brush and a small amount of fine sand to scour both the slab and the bottom of the muller, working until all traces of blue and red and yellow are gone, and the stone is its natural grey-green again, flecked with white crystals that sparkle as you rinse them. The washing is a satisfying task, the kind of cleaning that restores a tool to readiness, and when you are done, you dry everything with a cloth and carry the slab and muller back to their place on the shelf, where they will wait for the next grinding session. The afternoon continues its slow passage, and you find yourself with a few moments of stillness that you fill by standing at the window and looking out at the slice of sky visible above the rooftops. The sky is a pale blue, thin and high, with a few clouds that move so slowly you cannot see their motion, just their positions slightly changed when you look away and then look back. The sounds of the street have grown quieter as the afternoon deepens, the morning bustle replaced by a sleepy stillness, and only occasionally does a cart pass or a door open somewhere down the lane. You let your mind drift in this quiet, not thinking of anything in particular, just resting in the space between tasks, and you feel the tiredness in your feet and your shoulders, a mild, pleasant fatigue that comes from hours of standing and working with your hands. After a little while, you turn back to the drying line and check the sheet once more, and you see that the gloss has retreated further, the matte zone now covering most of the surface, leaving only a small shiny patch at the very center of each slope where the paper is thickest and the moisture lingers longest. The sheet is drying evenly, without any warping or cockling, and you are satisfied that it will be a good end paper, flat and true and ready for trimming when the time comes. You adjust nothing, because nothing needs adjusting, and you let the paper continue its drying while you return to the bench and lift the cloth from the tray to check the size. The surface is still, the refreshed gum solution as smooth as it was that morning, and you know that you could begin another pattern now if you chose to. But the afternoon is getting late and the light will soon begin to fail, and so you decide to leave the tray ready for the next day and turn your attention instead to the small chores that close the work cycle. You pour the remaining size from the pitcher into a clean jar and seal it with a cork, because the gum tragacanth solution will keep for several days if stored properly, and you set the jar in the cool corner near the water crock where it will stay fresh. The pitcher is rinsed and hung on its hook, the glass rod wiped and placed on its cloth, the bowls of pigment covered tightly and set on the shelf, where the indigo and lake and ochre will wait without complaint. The brushes are already drying, the grinding slab is clean, the muller is stored, and the bench is wiped down with a damp cloth that you rinse and wring out and hang over the edge of the bucket to dry. The shop around you is settling into its evening quiet, the master having put aside his tools and begun to close his own bench, and the clock continues its endless count, a sound that has been present all day and will be present all night, ticking into the darkness when no one is there to hear it. The marbled sheet is still on the line, and you will leave it there overnight because the drying must continue without interruption, the moisture leaving the fibers at its own pace, molecule by molecule, until the paper is as dry as the air around it, and the pattern is fixed forever. You take one last look at it before you untie your apron and hang it on its peg, the stained canvas swinging slightly and then settling, and you move toward the door with the same slow steps that brought you in that morning. The master nods at you as you pass, the same small inclination of the head, and you step out into the street where the afternoon has turned to early evening, and the light is golden on the rooftops, the air cool and still, and the walk home is a quiet continuation of the day's rhythm. The marbled sheet drying in the empty shop, the size resting in its tray, and the whole bindery waiting in the dusk for the morning when you will return and begin again. The morning arrives at the bindery in its usual way, a pale light creeping over the rooftops and finding the high window, and you step through the door to discover that the marbled sheets have finished their drying overnight. The shop still holds the coolness of the hours before dawn, the air resting against your cheeks like a cloth dipped in well water, but the chimney wall radiates a faint stored warmth that has kept the drying line in a gentle, constant embrace. You cross the floorboards with your apron still untied, the strings dangling at your sides, and you walk directly to the back of the shop, where the sheets hang in their row, their colors now fully matured into the soft, matte finish that marks a completed end paper. The gloss has departed entirely, leaving behind a surface as smooth and quiet as the skin of a polished stone, and the patterns that you drew yesterday with comb and stylus now present themselves in their final form, the waves and spirals showing a depth and subtlety that only the removal of moisture can reveal. One by one, you lift the sheets from the line, starting with the driest and oldest, those that have hung for 3 days or more, and you handle each with the careful fingers of someone who knows that paper is both strong and delicate, able to last centuries and yet easily torn by a careless grip. The first sheet comes away from the twine with a soft, crackling sound, the fibers stiff from their long exposure to the air, and you support its weight with your palm spread flat beneath it, the way you would carry a shallow bowl filled to the brim. The colors on this sheet are a pattern of blue and green that you made earlier in the week, a combination of indigo and verdigris that has dried to the hues of a deep forest pond, and as you turn it toward the light, you can see the intricate boundaries where the colors touch without mixing, the sharp edges preserved as cleanly as when they first floated on the size. You carry the sheet to your bench and set it down gently, then return for the next and the next, until the drying line is bare and all the marbled papers from the past several days lie stacked in a neat pile on the clean surface of your work table. Now the inspection begins, the task that requires you to become a kind of slow, patient machine, one that examines each sheet with the same unwavering attention. You take the first sheet from the top of the pile and carry it to the window, where the light falls at its brightest and most revealing, and you hold it at an angle that catches any imperfection, any pinhole or thin spot or drift in the pattern's regularity. The window pane is old glass, slightly wavy, and it casts a faint distortion on the paper, but your eyes have long since learned to see through that, to separate the flaws of the glass from the flaws of the sheet. You rotate the paper slowly, tilting it forward and back, letting the light rake across the surface and expose its secrets, and you look for the tiny unprinted white spots where a bubble of air may have been trapped during the transfer, or a place where the size was too thin and the colors sank, or an edge where the pattern failed to reach and left a bare margin of cream paper. Each sheet receives this same slow turning, this same quiet scrutiny, and you let nothing pass unchecked, because a marbled end paper will be seen every time the book is opened, and its perfection is a matter of quiet pride for the shop. The first sheet is good, its pattern full, and its surface unblemished, and you set it aside on a clean pressing board that you have laid out for this purpose. The second sheet, however, shows a small fault at the lower corner, a bare spot, no larger than a lentil, where the pigment did not take, perhaps because a speck of dust had settled on the size before you laid the paper. The rest of the sheet is beautiful, the waves and spirals as even as any you have made, but the bare spot disqualifies it from use as a full end paper, and so you place it in a separate pile, the pile of sheets that will be trimmed down and used for smaller projects or kept as practice stock. The third sheet is perfect, the fourth perfect, the fifth shows a slight drift in the pattern near one edge, where the comb must have wobbled for a fraction of a second, a wave that is slightly wider than its neighbors, and you study it for a long moment before deciding that the flaw is minor enough to be trimmed away, and you place it in the pile for trimming. Each decision is made without hurry, without frustration, because imperfect sheets are a natural part of the process, as inevitable as cloudy days or rain, and they do not trouble your calm any more than a single fallen leaf troubles a gardener. When all the sheets have been inspected, the piles on your bench tell the story of the week's work. The largest pile is the perfect sheets, the ones that will be pasted into books without any alteration, their patterns as you intended them, their colors rich and even, their edges true. The second pile is the sheets with minor edge flaws, those that can be rescued by trimming away a sliver of paper. The third pile is the small stack of rejects, the ones with flaws that no trimming can fix, which will be set aside for other uses or perhaps given to the master's young niece, who uses marbled scraps to cover tiny notebooks of her own making. You take a moment to look at the perfect pile, the stack of finished end papers that represents the best of your efforts, and the sight of it is quietly satisfying, a kind of silent harvest that asks for no celebration. Now the trimming must be done, and you reach for the tools that will accomplish it. The broad-bladed knife hangs on its hook near the window, a tool with a wooden handle worn to the shape of a hand and a flat rectangular blade of good steel that gleams faintly along its sharpened edge. Beside it hangs the steel ruler, a heavy, straight length of metal with a cork backing that grips the paper and prevents it from sliding, its measurements etched into the surface in fine, precise lines. You bring both to your bench and set them down. Then take the first sheet from the flawed pile, the one with the thin spot near the edge, and you lay it flat on the cutting surface, a smooth board of maple that has been scarred by countless knife strokes but still serves its purpose without complaint. The paper is perfectly flat now, having been pressed between boards overnight after its drying, and it lies against the maple with no ripple or curl. You position the steel ruler along the line where you want the cut to fall, a line that runs just inside the flawed edge, removing the imperfection while preserving the balance of the pattern. The ruler is heavy enough that you do not need to press hard to hold it in place. You simply set it down and let its weight and the cork backing do the work, and then you pick up the knife with your right hand, your fingers finding the familiar grip, the worn wood smooth and cool against your palm. The knife blade is angled slightly, and you bring it to the edge of the paper where it meets the ruler, the steel touching steel with a tiny precise click, and then you begin to draw the knife downward along the ruler's edge in a single, deliberate stroke. The cut makes a soft, sighing sound, the sound of paper fibers parting under a sharp blade, a whisper that is over almost as soon as it begins, and the sliver of paper falls away onto the bench, leaving behind a clean, straight edge that looks as though it had always been there. You set the knife down and lift the ruler, then turn the sheet 90 degrees and address the next edge, the one that had a slight nick from where the tray's rim had caught the paper during lifting, and you make another cut, the same soft sigh, the same clean result. By the time you finish, the sheet is slightly smaller than its original dimensions, but now perfectly square, its four edges crisp and true, its pattern centered and complete, and you place it onto the perfect pile, where it joins its companions as an equal. The next sheet requires trimming on only one edge, a narrow strip of white where the size had receded slightly from the corner of the tray, and you align the ruler and draw the knife in that same slow, steady motion, the sound of the cut blending with the ticking of the clock and the distant murmur of the master's voice as he speaks to a customer who has come to the door, a brief exchange of quiet words that fades back into the street. The trimming of multiple sheets takes time, each cut requiring its own careful alignment, its own steady hand, and you move through the pile one sheet at a time, not counting how many remain, just letting the rhythm carry you from one to the next. The knife is occasionally wiped with a cloth to remove any tiny fibers that cling to the blade, and the ruler is reset for each cut with the same gentle precision, the cork backing making a soft, tacky sound as it lifts from the paper and presses down again. As the trimmed pile grows, the master finishes his conversation and returns to his bench, the door closing with its familiar soft thud, and the shop settles back into its quiet hum. He begins to work on a new volume, a small duodecimo with a spine that requires delicate handling, and you hear the whisper of his needle entering the pages, a sound as constant as the pendulum and as reassuring. The light from the window continues its slow sweep across the floor, and you trim and trim, the knife moving in its steady strokes, the paper sighing each time a cut is completed, and your mind settles into a state of calm focus that is almost like meditation. Each action complete in itself, each sheet a small world of color and pattern and edge. When the last flawed sheet has been trimmed and the perfect pile now holds every usable end paper, you gather the scraps of trimmed paper from the bench, the narrow strips of marbled waste that curl like ribbons, and you place them in a small box that sits on the shelf beneath the pigment jars. These scraps are not thrown away. They will be used as test pieces for checking the consistency of paste, or as bookmarks, or as small decorative touches on the insides of box lids. Because in the bindery, nothing that can serve a purpose is ever discarded. The box is already half full of scraps from previous weeks, a chaotic jumble of colors and patterns that is itself a kind of accidental art, and you add today's contributions to the mix before closing the lid and returning the box to its place. Now the sorted piles must be put away correctly, and you turn to the stack of pressing boards that leans against the wall near the drying line. Each pressing board is a rectangle of thick, smooth wood, slightly larger than the sheets of marbled paper, and they are stacked alternately with sheets of clean, unprinted paper to distribute pressure evenly. You take one board and lay it flat on the bench, then place a marbled sheet on it. Then cover that with a sheet of plain paper, then another marbled sheet, then another plain paper, and so on, building a sandwich of end papers that will keep them flat and protected until they are needed. The sheets are interleaved with the plain stock to prevent any possible transfer of color from one marbled surface to another, even though the colors are fully dry. This is a precaution that costs nothing but a few sheets of scrap paper and guarantees that the end papers will remain pristine. When the stack is complete, you top it with another pressing board and set the whole thing under a light weight, an old flat iron that the master uses for this purpose, its handle wrapped in cloth to keep it from rusting. The perfect pile and the trimmed pile have now become a single unified stack between pressing boards, and the rejects remain on the bench, a small handful of sheets that will go into a different storage location. You carry the rejects to a flat drawer in the cupboard near the water crock, a drawer that holds other imperfect marbled papers. Some dating back years, their patterns as varied as the weeks in which they were made. You slide the drawer open and lay the sheets inside, their edges aligned, and then close it again, the drawer fitting snugly into its runners with a soft wooden sigh. With the sorting and trimming complete, the bench is clear again. The knife and ruler return to their hooks, the scraps boxed and shelved, the finished end papers pressed and weighted. The morning has passed quietly into early afternoon, and you take a moment to stand still and let your eyes rest, the way you might rest your hands after a long task. The shop around you remains as it always is, the clock ticking, the dust motes drifting, the master sewing, the light falling in its steady beam across the marbling tray that still waits with its cloth cover, the size beneath it as still as it was the day before. The end papers you have inspected and prepared are now part of the shop's inventory, ready to be pasted into the covers of waiting books, and the thought of them sitting between their pressing boards, their colors glowing softly in the dim light, is a pleasant one that you hold for a moment before letting it go. You walk to the window and look out at the street, where a single cart passes with a load of barrels, the driver calling out something you cannot quite hear, his voice muffled by the glass. The sun is higher now, the shadows shorter, and the morning's coolness has given way to the gentle warmth of midday. You turn away from the window and untie your apron, not to leave but to hang it on its peg while you step out for a short meal. The afternoon's work still ahead of you, but the inspection and trimming and sorting have been completed, and the end papers are ready, and the shop is quiet, and all is well. The stack of marbled end papers has been resting between its pressing boards under the weight of the old flat iron, and now the moment has come to attach one of those sheets to the book that has been waiting for its completion. The master brings the volume forward from his bench, carrying it in both hands the way one carries a small animal, cradled but secure, and he sets it down on your work table with a soft, solid sound that speaks of the weight of paper and board and leather, all pressed together. This is the book that will receive the marbled end paper, a volume that has travelled through many hands and many stages to arrive at this point in its creation. The text block has been sewn on linen cords, the spine rounded and backed with a gentle hammering that shaped the folded gatherings into a smooth, even curve, and the boards have been cut from dense binder's board and covered in the calfskin that you remember seeing on the master's bench, a warm brown leather the color of dried oak leaves. The book now lacks only its end papers to be truly finished, those sheets that will bridge the hardcover and the soft pages, and you are the one who will give it this final piece. You open the pressing stack carefully, lifting the top board and peeling back the plain interleaving sheets until you find the marbled paper you have chosen for this particular volume. A sheet whose pattern of blue and red and yellow seems to complement the brown leather with a quiet harmony. The paper slides out from between its neighbors with a faint rustle, and you hold it up to the light for a final inspection, though you have already inspected it once. The pattern is perfect, the waves even, the spirals crisp, the colors rich and matte and fully dry, and you set it down on the bench with its marbled side facing downward, the clean cream reverse facing up toward you. This reverse side is the one that will receive the paste and adhere to the cover board, and you take a moment to smooth it flat with the palm of your hand, chasing away any ghost of a curl that might have crept in despite the pressing. The paste must now be prepared, and you turn to the small copper bowl that hangs on its hook near the pigment shelf, a vessel with a rounded bottom and a narrow lip, its interior tinned to a bright silver that gleams when you tilt it toward the light. You set the bowl on the bench and take down the jar of wheat starch from the cupboard, a fine white powder that feels like silk between your fingers and smells faintly of the fields where the wheat once grew. You measure a spoonful of the starch into the bowl, then add cool water from a small pitcher, pouring in a thin stream while you stir with a wooden spatula, the water and starch swirling together into a thin, milky mixture that shows no lumps. The stirring is a gentle motion, the spatula moving in a circle that widens and tightens as you work, and the sound it makes against the copper is a soft, rhythmic scrape, a note that blends with the ticking clock and the creak of the master's stool. When the starch and water are combined into a smooth liquid, you carry the copper bowl to the small hearth at the back of the shop, where a low bed of embers still glows from the morning's fire. You set the bowl on a trivet over the warmth, not directly in the heat, but close enough that the liquid will begin to thicken, and you stir it slowly, continuously, keeping the spatula moving so that no skin forms on the surface and no lump gathers at the bottom. The paste heats gradually, the white liquid turning translucent as the starch grains swell and burst and release their binding power, and the stirring becomes slightly heavier, the spatula now moving through a substance that clings to the wood in thin, glossy streaks. The smell of the paste as it thickens is a clean, mild scent, like laundry dried in the sun or the steam from a pot of plain rice, and it fills the corner of the shop with a homely, comforting note. When the paste has reached the right consistency, thick enough to cling to the spatula, but thin enough to spread easily under a brush, you lift the bowl from the trivet with a folded cloth protecting your hand and carry it back to your bench, where you set it on a small earthenware tile that will protect the wood from the heat. Now the paste must cool slightly before it can be used, because boiling paste applied to paper can cause the fibers to swell too quickly and warp the sheet, and so you let the copper bowl sit on its tile while you gather the other tools you will need for the pasting. You take down a wide, flat brush from the rack, a brush with soft hob bristles that spread into a fan shape when you press them against a surface, and you set it beside the bowl along with a bone folder, a smooth, polished length of ox bone that fits the hand like a smooth stone, its edges rounded and its tip pointed for working into corners. You also bring a clean sheet of waste paper to the bench, laying it flat, to protect the marbled surface of the end paper from any stray paste that might find its way underneath during the work. The preparation is calm and complete, each tool in its place, each material ready, and the book waits on the bench with its cover open, the blank board exposed and waiting for its end paper. You test the paste with the tip of your finger, touching the surface gently and feeling that the warmth has subsided to a tolerable heat, and then you pick up the wide brush and dip the bristles into the copper bowl, drawing them through the paste so that they load evenly from ferrule to tip. The paste is smooth and glossy on the brush, a translucent white jelly that catches the light, and you carry the loaded brush to the marbled sheet that lies face down on the waste paper, its reverse side waiting like a clean canvas. You begin to spread the paste across the paper with long, even strokes, starting at the center and moving outward toward the edges. the bristles laying down a thin, uniform coat that covers every part of the surface without leaving any dry spot. The brush moves from center to top edge, center to bottom edge, center to left side, center to right side, and then you work it diagonally into the corners, the bristles fanning out to reach into the angles, and the paste goes on smoothly, wetting the paper and causing it to relax and expand ever so slightly, the fibers drinking in the moisture and becoming soft and pliable. The sound of the brush on the paper is a soft, rhythmic swish, a whisper that repeats with each stroke, and you work without haste, making sure that the coat is even, that no puddle of paste sits too thickly in any one area, and no starved patch remains untreated. When the paper is fully pasted and glistening with moisture, you set the brush down across the bowl and lift the sheet carefully by its edges, your fingertips touching only the narrow margins where no paste has spread. The pasted paper is heavier now and slightly limp, the moisture making it behave differently than the dry, crisp sheet it was a moment ago, and you carry it to the book with a steady hand, holding it so that the pasted side faces downward toward the open coverboard. The book rests on the bench with its cover lying flat, the inside of the board exposed, a rectangle of plain binder's board covered in the turn-in of the brown calfskin, and you position the end paper above it, aligning the edges with the edges of the board, checking the margins on all four sides to make sure that the paper will sit squarely and leave an even border of leather around it. The lowering of the paper onto the board is a motion that cannot be undone once made, because the paste grabs almost instantly, and so you take a final moment to confirm the alignment, your eyes moving from this corner to that corner, this edge to that edge, and then you let the paper descend, touching the center first and then smoothing outward with your hands, letting it settle onto the board in a gentle rolling contact that pushes out any air. The paper meets the board with a soft, wet sound, and you smooth it with your palms, feeling the slight coolness of the paste through the paper, pressing gently from the center toward the edges, persuading the sheet to lie flat and adhere completely. The marbled side of the paper, the side with the pattern, is now facing upward, and you can see the waves and spirals shining wetly through the thin film of moisture that has seeped through from the paste below. The colors darken temporarily and then brightening again as the moisture equilibrates. Now the bone folder comes into your hand, that smooth, polished tool that has been used in binderies for centuries, its oxbone pale and warm to the touch. Its edges curve to prevent tearing the paper. You bring the folder to the center of the end paper and begin to rub it outward toward the edges with a firm, steady pressure, the bone sliding over the paper with a faint, silky hiss. The rubbing is a slow, deliberate motion, the folder moving from the hinge, where the board meets the spine, outward to the foredge, and then from the center outward to the top and bottom edges, pressing the paper into the board, chasing any tiny pockets of air or excess paste toward the margins where they can escape. The paper grows smoother under the folder with each pass, the bond between paper and board strengthening as the paste is forced into the fibers of both materials, and the end paper becomes one with the cover in a union that will hold for as long as the book exists. The sound of the folder is a soft, rhythmic shush, a sound that has accompanied the finishing of books since the first binder shaped the first bone, and you fall into its rhythm, rubbing and smoothing, your wrist moving in a pattern that covers every inch of the surface, leaving no part unburnished. The edges of the paper receive special attention, the tip of the folder running along the perimeter where the end paper meets the leather turn-in, pressing the paper down into the joint so that it lies flush and smooth. No wrinkle must remain, no lifted edge, no bubble that will dry into a permanent blemish, and you work the folder around the entire border with slow, careful strokes, your head bent close to the work, so that you can see the finest details. The master watches from his bench, not with any anxiety but with a calm, distant attention, his hands resting on the book he is trimming, and he says nothing, because there is nothing to say. The work is being done as it should be done, and words would only disturb the quiet concentration that fills the space around the bench. When the end paper is fully rubbed down and lies flat and smooth against the board, you set the folder aside and take a clean, dry cloth to wipe away any trace of paste that may have squeezed out at the edges, a thin white bead that you catch with the folded corner of the cloth and lift away. The joint is clean, the paper is tight, and the marbled pattern now adorns the inside cover of the book with its waves and spirals glowing against the brown leather, a decoration that will greet the reader every time the volume is opened. The end paper still feels slightly damp, the moisture from the paste slowly evaporating into the air of the shop. And you know that it will dry over the course of the afternoon, pulling the board slightly inward as it does so. A tension that is perfectly normal and will be corrected by the pressing that follows. Now the other cover must receive its end paper in the same way, and you turn the book over gently, taking care not to stress the fresh hinge, and you open the second board so that it lies flat and waiting on the bench. You return to the stack of marbled sheets and select another, one that matches the first in pattern and color, and you lay it face down on the waste paper and paste it with the same careful brushstrokes, center to edges, corner to corner, the swish of the bristles repeating the rhythm you have already established. The second pasting goes quickly, your hands remembering the motions, and you carry the sheet to the book and position it and lower it and smooth it and rub it down with the folder until it too is flat and perfect. A twin to the first end paper, the two of them now part of the same volume, the same book, the same object that will one day sit on a shelf in a library or a private study and be opened by hands you will never meet. With both end papers attached, the book must be closed carefully and placed under weight to dry, and you bring a clean sheet of waxed paper to lay between each end paper and the first page of the text block, a barrier that will prevent any stray moisture from the paste from cockling the printed pages. Then you close the covers slowly, letting the book settle into its natural shape, the spine curving, the boards meeting the text block, the whole thing becoming a single unified object that no longer shows the separate pieces from which it was made. You carry the book to the small table near the window where the pressing weights are kept, and you set it down between two clean boards, then place a flat iron weight on top, a heavy piece of cast metal with a wooden handle, its surface dark and smooth from age. The book will sit here for several hours, perhaps overnight, while the paste dries and the paper contracts and the whole structure firms into its final permanence, and you leave it there with the confidence that the work is done. You return to your bench and clean the tools, rinsing the brush in the bucket of water, watching the paste cloud out of the bristles in white wisps, and you wipe the bone folder with a damp cloth and dry it with a dry one, restoring it to its polished shine. The copper bowl is taken to the back and scrubbed with a small brush until no trace of paste remains, and then it is dried and hung on its hook, ready for the next time it will be needed. The waste paper that protected the bench is folded and set aside, to be used again or to be discarded if too soiled, and the bench is wiped clean with a damp cloth, the surface left smooth and bare, waiting for the next day's work. The afternoon has grown later during your task, the light from the window taking on the golden quality of the hours before evening, and the shop is as quiet as it has been all day. The clock ticking, the dust drifting, the master now polishing the spine of a finished book with a soft, circular motion of his cloth. The book you have worked on sits under its weight, drying into itself, the marbled end papers hidden now between the covers, but ready to surprise and delight whoever opens the volume. A secret beauty that will wait for its moment. You stand at your bench with your hands resting on the clean wood, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a task completed, a piece of work that has moved from your hands into the world, and the feeling is calm and warm, like the glow of the embers in the hearth, and it asks for nothing but to be felt. The book rests under its pressing weight on the small table near the window, the flat iron sitting squarely on the clean boards that sandwich the volume, and the paste that holds the marbled end papers to the calfskin covers is drying slowly, molecule by molecule, the water evaporating into the warm air of the shop while the starch binds the paper fibers to the board in a grip that will last for centuries. You stand at your bench with your hands still, your apron still tied around your waist, and you look around the room with the slow, quiet attention of someone who has finished the main work of the day and now prepares to close the shop for the evening. The afternoon has passed through the window and gone, leaving behind a sky that has begun its shift toward the softer colors of dusk, a pale lavender seeping into the blue above the rooftops, and the light inside the bindery has dimmed from gold to grey, the shadows stretching out from the shelves and the presses and the stools, claiming back the corners that the morning had brightened. The tools on your bench are still out, the brushes and the bone folder and the copper bowl and the glass rod and the marbling tray, and they must be put away properly before you leave, because a binder who leaves his tools scattered is a binder who will waste half the next morning searching for what he needs. You begin the cleaning in the same order you always do. A sequence that has become as automatic as breathing, your hands moving from one task to the next without any need for decision or thought. The marbling tray still holds the size, which has sat under its cloth all afternoon, and you lift the cover and look at the surface, which is still clear and still. The gun tragacanth having lost none of its patience during the hours of waiting. You could leave the size in the tray until tomorrow, but the master prefers that the tray be emptied and cleaned at the end of each day, because a wooden basin filled overnight with a liquid that slowly sours can develop a smell and a stain that are difficult to remove, and so you take the tray to the bucket in the corner and tilt it carefully, pouring the size out in a slow, thick stream that folds into the bucket with a soft, glugging sound. The size is still good, still capable of floating colors, but you have poured only what you needed for the day and no more, and the loss is small and acceptable. You rinse the tray with clean water from the crock, splashing it gently around the corners and then pouring that out too, and you dry the interior with a clean cloth, wiping along the seams and the pitch-sealed corners until the wood is dry and smooth, ready to be hung on its hook until the next morning. The bowls of pigment must be dealt with next, the small white vessels that still hold the remains of the indigo and crimson lake and yellow ochre. You take each bowl to the back of the shop and scrape the remaining pigment back into its original jar with a small horn spatula, working carefully so that no color spills onto the bench or the floor, and the bright pastes slide back into their jars with a soft, reluctant sound, the blue darkening the mouth of its vessel, the red staining the rim, the yellow settling into the bottom like a little sun. The jars are corked tightly and returned to the pigment shelf where they stand in their accustomed row, their labels facing outward, their contents ready for the next grinding and thinning. The bowls themselves are taken to the bucket and rinsed with water, the residue of color clouding out and fading, and you scrub them with a small cloth until they are white again, their glazed interiors gleaming in the dim light, and then you dry them and stack them upside down on the shelf where they live. The brushes are already clean from their earlier washing, but you check them anyway, running your thumb across the bristles to make sure no stiffness has developed, and you shape the tips with your fingers before laying them flat on their cloth, the bristles all pointing the same direction, the handles aligned with the edge of the bench, a neat row that will greet you in the morning. The comb and the stylus are wiped with a dry cloth, the brass wires and the brass pin polished of any lingering moisture, and they are hung on their hooks where they sway slightly and then settle, their leather loops dark against the pale wall. The glass rod is wiped and placed on its folded cloth. The grinding slab and muller are checked one final time for cleanliness. The copper paste bowl is upturned on its hook. The bone folder is wiped and returned to its slot in the rack, and each tool in turn is touched and cleaned and put away with the same unhurried care, the same gentlest tension, until the bench is bare and clean and ready for the next day's labor. The master has also been closing his own bench, and you hear him moving behind you, the soft sounds of his tools being put away, the click of a press being loosened, the rustle of leather scraps being folded and stored, the quiet steps of his feet on the floorboards as he moves from shelf to cupboard and back again. He has finished the volume he was working on, a small octavo with a spine of polished calf and a title tooled in gold, and the book now sits on the finished shelf near the door, a shelf that holds the books that are ready to be wrapped in paper and delivered to their owners. The sight of the completed books on that shelf is always a quiet pleasure, a row of spines in different colors, some brown, some red, some dark green, each one holding pages that have been folded and sewn and trimmed and covered, each one a small monument to the patience of the craft, and the new volume with the marbled end papers will join them tomorrow when the paste is fully dry and the pressing is complete. You untie your apron now, pulling the strings loose from behind your back and lifting the loop over your head, and you hold the apron for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the canvas stained with pigments and paste and size, the fabric softened by wear, the pocket still holding a few stray scraps of paper and a bit of thread. You fold the apron once, twice, and hang it on its peg near the door, where it joins the master's apron on its own peg, the two of them hanging side by side like old companions who have spent the day together and will spend the night in the same quiet darkness. Your hands feel light without the apron, your arms free, and you stretch your shoulders slightly, a small movement that releases the tension of the day, the accumulated strain of bending over the tray and the bench and the paste bowl. You walk to the window and look out at the sky, which has deepened further into that shade between day and night that the painters call the blue hour, a color that reminds you of the indigo pigment you ground this morning, that deep, rich blue that seems to drink the light. The street below is quiet now, the carts and the voices having retreated into the houses and courtyards, and only a single lamp has been lit in a window across the way, its flame a small steady point of yellow that flickers occasionally when a draught finds it. The roofs of the buildings slope away in a jumble of tiles and chimneys, their shapes growing softer as the light fails, and the whole city seems to be settling into itself, drawing its shutters and quieting its sounds, preparing for the long, slow hours of the night. The clock on the mantel shelf chimes the hour, a soft musical note that rings once and then fades, and you turn from the window and take one last look around the shop, checking that everything is in its place, that no tool has been forgotten, that no jar has been left uncorked, that the fire in the hearth has been left uncorked, that the fire in the hearth has been banked to a safe low glow. The drying line is empty now, the marbled sheets all taken down and trimmed and pressed, and the line sags slightly in the middle, waiting for the next wet sheet, the next pattern, the next transfer of color from liquid to paper. The marbling tray hangs on its hook, clean and dry, and the size that you poured out earlier is already soaking into the scrap bucket. Its work for the day complete, and its substance returned to the water from which it came. The pigments sleep in their jars, the brushes lie on their cloth, the bone folder gleams in its slot, and everything is as it should be, a world in miniature, ordered and calm and waiting. You walk toward the door, your footsteps creaking on the same floorboards that have creaked under your weight 1,000 times, and you pass the finished shelf where the books stand in their neat row, their spines straight, their end papers hidden, their pages full of words that someone will read in some quiet room by some other window. The book you worked on today is not yet on the shelf, still under its weight and still drying, but you can picture it there, its brown calfskin spine nestled between its companions, its marbled end papers ready to surprise the first reader who opens the cover and sees the waves and spirals that you drew with comb and stylus on a tray of gum tragacanth size. The thought is a pleasant one, but you let it go without clinging to it, the way you let every thought go in this quiet hour, and you lift your jacket from the hook near the door and slip your arms into the sleeves, the cloth cool from hanging in the dim entryway. The master is still at his bench, finishing the last of his own tidying, and he looks up as you pass and nods again, the same small inclination of the head that he gave you when you arrived this morning, a gesture that contains everything that needs to be said between two people who have worked together in silence for many hours and many days, a recognition, a farewell, a quiet promise that the work will continue tomorrow. You nod back, your hand on the door handle, and then you pull the door open and step out into the street, where the evening air meets you with its cool, clean scent, the smell of stone and old wood, and the distant river, the smell of the city settling into dusk. The street is empty now, the cobbles glistening faintly with a dampness that has risen as the temperature falls, and you walk slowly, your footsteps echoing softly between the close walls of the houses, a rhythm that matches the rhythm of your breathing, slow and steady and calm. Above you, the sky has deepened to a rich indigo, the same indigo you ground on the porphyry slab, and a single star has appeared in the gap between two chimneys, a point of pale light that seems to pulse very slightly as you watch it. The bakeries have closed, the shops have shut their doors, and the only sound is the distant murmur of the river and the occasional bark of a dog in some far courtyard, a sound that comes and goes and leaves the silence deeper than before. You think of the gum tragacanth, that humble resin that travelled from rocky hillsides to this city, and how it thickened the water and held the colours, and then transferred them to paper, and then dried and vanished, its work done and its presence invisible but essential, a hidden thread in the fabric of the book. Your walk takes you through the familiar streets, past the fountain where the water trickles even at night, past the church with its dark bell tower, past the closed stalls of the market where the canvas covers sigh in the slight breeze, and each landmark is a point on a map you could trace with your eyes shut, each corner a familiar shape in the dimness. The day is over now, the work is done, and the feeling in your chest is a quiet one, a sense of completion that is not excitement or pride, but simply the gentle settling of a task that was begun and carried through and finished. the way a leaf settles onto still water after falling from its branch. You think of the marbled end paper drying in the shop, the waves and spirals fixed forever in the fibers, and you think of the book that will be opened someday by someone who does not know your name and will never see your hands, and the thought is like the star above the chimneys, a small, steady point of light in the vast, quiet darkness of the world. You turn the last corner and your own door appears, and you reach for the handle with the same hand that held the brush and the comb and the bone folder, and you step inside and close the door behind you, and the street is empty again, and the night settles over the city, and the bindery waits in the darkness for the morning, the clock ticking on in the silence, the tools hanging on their hooks, the new book pressing under its weight, and everything ready to begin again when the light returns,